Hi, everyone. Thanks for opening this Sunday's newsletter. I'm glad that you're here. This video is going to provide you a bit of an aerial view of the work that I tend to do in K-12 schools, as well as some of the things I've been sharing on the road this spring and plan to share more of this summer around bringing a multimodal process into our writing classrooms and workshops, as well as thinking about grading and assessment and how we might build better writers by supporting all of the modes of expression in some ways that are pretty intentional. If you are a member or subscriber to my newsletter, then you know that I really do love a good swag bag. I'll be sharing these slides, and inside you can click on this link to access free resources that I tend to update in real time as each of my sessions unfold. You can also click on these links to stay in touch with me in other places through social media. And if you were in the Alberta sessions, you know that I do have a supplemental materials page. Be sure to revisit your specific slide deck. You can find those materials there. Oftentimes, my conversations about making and writing are steeped in my own experiences and those that I've enjoyed with lots of teachers over the last 20 years or so. Our work has always been something that we document carefully. We try to make not only our learning visible, but we invite students to make their learning visible as well. And we really are thoughtful about whether or not we're going to pursue a more deductive or inductive process. When I coach making and writing curriculum and assessment design that supports it, I'm really clear about the fact that these practices play really well no matter which resources, materials, textbooks, or series you might be using. I tend to remain pretty agnostic there because so much of what I've learned has really helped me realize that it's not what we're using for resources, but how we're leveraging them that really seems to matter. Oftentimes, I'm working with teachers who already have theories or ideas about teaching and assessing writing well that they want to test during our work together. And if that's you, you might be coming into this learning process that I'm encouraging you to create, taking a more deductive documentation approach. As you test some of the ideas I'm sharing with you today, try to capture evidence of your learning. And as you do so, think about what it means and what's being revealed as a result of that work. You might be incorporating some theories or ideas that you're already really familiar with, or something that you just learned about or discovered in your reading or through other professional development means. If that's the case, ask yourself, as you're implementing that theory or idea, what could serve as evidence of your own learning? What could you document, and when and where? Who might be involved in that documentation process or captured through it? Is there anyone you could co-plan it with, and will you need helpers along the way? You might also implement some of the ideas that I'm sharing here with you today with the intention to uncover things that were a bit unexpected. Maybe you're just going to try and capture as much of the learning experience as you can, and then use the data that you gather in the form of photographs or annotations, artifacts of learning or recordings, and then interpret them in the end. Either way, I really invite you to begin any work that you're doing with making and writing or multimodal composition and expression. Begin it with the intention to document your learning so that you can discover things from that process that you might not have otherwise. Our learning stories really matter, and on this particular slide, I'm sharing some prompts with you that might encourage you to document for a specific purpose that may seem sort of low lift, but typically reveals things that are really quite powerful to all of us. I'm very thankful to colleagues in the field like Dave Gray and Sonny Brown Dave Mastronardi has always been a huge support to me in the past as I've lacked confidence in my own drawing skills. And I feel it makes me sort of empathetic with teachers and students that I work with when they tell me that they can't draw either. It's the work of these thinkers that brought me to the visual alphabet, which I tend to display in any room that I'm working in, whether it's with children or with teachers. The theory is that if you can draw any of these things, you can draw anything with them. So your ability to compose the visual alphabet empowers you to really doodle or sketch anything that you want. And these are also loose parts that you can mix and remix, combine, recombine in order to generate all sorts of different types of illustrations. When I was in some of your schools this spring and into the summer, I invited lots of you to use loose parts from our tables, like Legos and blocks and feathers and stones. And I also invited you to use, if you chose, the visual alphabet to build me a tree from your childhood memories. And as you did that, I walked the room and I got a sense of how well you were able to meet this particular learning target or expectation. What was really powerful is that so many of you started storytelling and sharing your experiences with these trees with the people that were sitting near you, even before I invited you to. But then soon enough, I asked you to build me a vignette and I gave you this particular structure because structure really matters. I talked about how once we knew the structure of a story, once we were certain that writers had a viable idea, they were able to rapidly design those four pieces using materials, we could then teach into them one step at a time. I spoke about how if we teach just the very beginning and we offer writers structure and strategies, and we actually demonstrate how to produce just the very beginning of their story, they're able to transition to written words in a far more productive way. Rather than going for volume or length or having writers compose into the depths of the draft, having them build and then write just the beginning gives us the ability to differentiate the learning targets a bit as well as the strategies that we're offering. And so when I'm thinking about how do we know if students are really progressing toward our grade level outcomes? This is one way that I encourage that. Option A is typically aligned in my world to our grade level standards or expectations. All students will be able maybe to describe the place that their tree is situated in using their senses, and that comes right from the standards. Option B is a little bit more challenging, and writers might try to make the place a person. Option C is even more challenging than that, where they might compare the place to another thing. Offering these differentiated approaches also prevents the I'm done syndrome. When writers tell me that they've finished with option A or B or C, I encourage them to try the others. When they tell me that they did all three of them, I encourage them to practice synthesis. And usually at this point, they're beginning to realize that good writers don't write fast and long into a draft, that they actually savor one small bit and their own writing, and they tinker with it, they play with it, they test different strategies in order to get better. This really encourages metaphorical thinking. Loose parts intuitively, organically sort of encourage writers to automatically and without thinking about it use metaphorical thinking. When you're asked to represent a feeling using puzzle pieces or paint chips, when you're asked to represent an idea using something like Lego, you're thinking in representative ways, and you automatically begin to use simile, metaphor, and symbol as a result. When we're patient and we teach into drafts one small bit of the structure at a time, it's easy for writers to protect all of that gorgeous complexity as they transition to written words. When I was working with teachers on the ground in Alberta this spring using this particular set of slides, I asked them to pause, document, and reflect on their learning after sharing that really first few set of strategies and ideas. We talked about the fact that too often we don't talk about how we know when we're learning and what that actually feels like. Learning is a deeply embodied experience, and it's different for each of us. If you're someone who's passionate about documenting their learning well and learning how to do that even better, I encourage you to start paying attention to and defining the nuances inside of your own experiences here. What does it feel like when you are documenting your own learning? Pause and reflect on everything I've shared for the last 11 minutes if you'd like. What are you learning and how do you know? How does that feel? I remember the first time I encountered Bill Cope and Mary Calancis's work. It was Trevor Alio, who is now a student of theirs, who introduced me to all of their gorgeous thinking, important thinking about the representational nature of loose parts. If you are interested in some of the research that grounds my very uncommon approach to teaching writing, you might want to click on this link and fall down that rabbit hole for the entire summer, and you could. Because they've shared the whole of their work, they've made it open source, and it is an important learning, I think, for anyone who's teaching, reading, writing, or communication. Their big ideas really have to do with the fact that literacy is not about the production and consumption of written words. It's really about representation and being able to define ideas and concepts for ourselves first. It's also about communication, sharing those ideas and concepts with others in a just right fashion, and then interpretation, making meaning from what is shared. And in this way, then, grammar lives under the umbrella that is design. And every sort of multimodal composition has a grammar of its own. When I visited Reggio Emilia, Italy, I also learned that even materials speak a language of their own. Clay speaks a language that's quite different from blocks, and blocks speak a language that's quite different from watercolor or that visual alphabet. Literate people are able to transition and transpose meaning across forms using multiple modes of expression. But one of the most important things I want to leave with some of you with today is this. When we reduce writing to the production of written words alone, and we only invite the production of written words to improve the production of written words, we actually undermine writers' abilities to do that. Literacy is richly multimodal, and it's not just about, in my experience, representation, communication, and interpretation, where multimodality really plays a part. Each mode of expression supports the development of the others. So when we diminish writing to the production of alphabetic letters, words, phrases, passages, we make it increasingly difficult for writers to do that in sophisticated ways. And I'll give you some context for that in a minute. There are 6 different modes of expression that we know of right now, and maybe perhaps more in the future, and ones that we have not yet uncovered. Alphabetic expression is what is privileged most often inside of our schools, and my friend Shauna Coppola speaks to that and uses that framing often. It has to do with the production of written letters and words. Visual expression has everything to do with things like illustrations and images, while spatial expression has to do with how we lay them out in space, besides other assets like letters, words, titles, subtitles, tables, charts, and graphs. Gestural expression has to do with small body movement, facial expression, And also the clothing that we wear, the jewelry that we wear, and what that reveals about our identities. Oral expression has everything to do with designing in ways that can be heard. And haptics have to do with texture and vibration. I've said this before, it's a great example. If you remember who Helen Keller is, then you know that her teacher Annie helped her become literate initially by using sign language and shaping letters in her hand so that she could feel them. Helen was both blind and deaf, and this enabled her to develop an understanding of how people were communicating with her. I shared three different stories on the road a couple of weeks ago. One about one of my students, Kayla, who was actually writing graphic novels at home and not really bringing them to school. She was creating fan fiction that was very much like the Twilight series and sort of responsive to it. She was doing all of that in her bedroom in notebooks that her mom shared with me, while she was producing nothing for my class because she worried she wouldn't have permission to do that. That was a deeply humbling moment. Luke was another young writer that I worked with who was not interested and very frustrated when I asked him to reduce stories with written words, but he did it with Legos. And Mariana was a student who was a newcomer to the country, and she was very interested in making an argument about an issue that was concerning her in her neighborhood. She was able to do that eventually by building her argument bit by bit and then transitioning it to written words in ways that elevated the work of her translator, and ensured that she was doing true inquiry work as a learner as well, even though she was only in the country for a very short period of time. If you worked with me in any setting this spring or summer, then these conversations were a big part of our time together. I spoke about the fact that when I first began bringing loose parts into my writing workshop, I was really astounded by how many of the writers that I was supporting took to them, built really sophisticated ideas with them and drafts, and then because we were working with structure and they were only transitioning one small bit at a time, they were willing to really protect the complexity of just the beginning or just the middle or just the end. They were willing to hang on to those sophisticated ideas and vocabulary words, and they were patient with their word and sentence and passage level work, transitioning it from a representation that was made with perhaps Legos or clay, and then transitioning that to a representation that was made, of course, with letters and words. I didn't understand why that was happening. And at the time, I used a grounded theory approach that was the first cycle of my research. And I knew that loose parts, that making was impacting the quality of the writing that was emerging, but I didn't know why. It took about 5 or 6 more years, 2 more cycles of research, and a return to the literature of different fields, specifically anthropology, history, and linguistics, to help me understand that there are cultural differences and differences in cultural values that influence how writers come to produce written words or come to read. And you'll find some of those findings on these slides, and you're welcome to pause the screen and have a peek at them. Of course, it's not as though we can give a blood test, or we would want to determine if someone is coming from a primarily communal culture or an individualistic culture. And our world and our families have become so globalized at this point that it would be almost impossible to be able to trace that, perhaps. We also don't want to assume a more stereotypical posture. So I will tell you that my awareness of these differences in cultural values, it helps me understand that I have deep biases and that I typically design writing experiences that it would be comfortable for people like me. And so when writers don't necessarily show up the way that I expect them to, it's not because they are necessarily struggling or they are doing something wrong. It might be that I've created a deeply biased writing experience that is not at all culturally relevant to the kids that are in front of me or even the adults. Understanding cultural differences in expression helps me check my biases and maybe move in different ways and listen to my students better and follow them and trust that they have intelligences, experiences, skills that I may not. It's helped me rethink how I teach writing in dramatic ways as well. And so I'll ask you again if you'd like to pause, document, and reflect. My friend and my former student, Maggie Burns, designed these 4 questions that really prompt deeper reflection. As you sat through the last 8 minutes, what happened there that shifted your thinking? And how did it make you feel? What fostered that feeling, and what might you do with it now? These are great reflective tools, and I'm grateful to Maggie and to Aaron Shorn and Will Rupin at Unruler for making them public. I want to pause here and invite you to reach out to me if there's something that was particularly helpful about what I just shared, if there's something that you would like me to change or think on that might help you even more. Is there something about how I just explained these ideas to you that would be more useful if I shifted it in some specific way? I hope you'll reach out and let me know. Or you might have a question that you'd like me to answer, and I'm happy to do that as well. When I began to consider cultural differences and cultural values, it helped me understand why structure seemed to matter so much in my early research, right before I wrote Make Writing. It became very obvious to me that if I asked students to use loose parts to represent the parts of any form, they were able to share the full complexity of their ideas. This also supported encoding in ways that were surprising to me. It's one thing to transition from oral expression to written expression, and I understand the complexities of encoding in the context that we've always been pretty familiar with. But what makes loose parts play in making and writing an essential part of the process is that the loose parts can represent ideas that children may not yet have print power for, adults as well. They serve as a container for them, something that they can hold on to cognitively. And if we transition to written words just one small bit at a time, children will often be willing to experiment with the spelling of those words. They'll often hang in there when I invite them to segment those words and sound them out, to whisper write in ways that allow them to hear those segments even as they're producing them. Students who are older are very much willing, if we're going bit by bit, to use resources and tools that help them segment those words more effectively, learn how to spell them, and even study the morphology of those words. Loose parts play enables them to keep pace with their ideas as well and tinker and revise them because they have not overcommitted to print. And the representational nature of those loose parts is also a bit protective. If students decide that revealing some element of meaning around those loose parts is too vulnerable for them, they can hold it back, even as they express it in this more symbolic way. While this is one process that has served some writers very well, as a teacher in my own classroom for 15 years, as a staff developer for Western New York area branch of the New York State Department of Education, and in my work with young writers and teachers now in many different states and different countries in the world, I've learned that this process, as we've defined it, doesn't tend to serve as many as well as we would prefer. But when it looks like this, I tend to see writers gaining much faster traction and much more satisfaction from their work. I also see them producing far more sophisticated written words over time. If we center instruction around structure, and we wrap the process around each bit of the structure, where they build the character and setting at the beginning of their story, they better the build, they transcribe it, they revise it, and they do this maybe through 3 or 4 different lessons that focus on craft, and then a couple of lessons that focus on the linguistic nature of the work, conventions, grammar, language skills, vocabulary. They tend to polish up a beautiful bit of writing that serves as the beginning of their story, and it really sings. And when we repeat that process through each dimension of the form, by the time the draft is done, it's of much higher quality. We have wound the process around each bit of it in a way that makes it the sort of recursive process that Donald Graves always spoke about. And we can also fit in a lot of language work, word work, sentence level work that typically we waited until the end of the process to try to fit in, and we suffered for it, and so did our students. One of the things that you'll find in my digital swag bag is the Make Writing Starter Set. It's a pretty robust resource. Some of you who have been around for a while are very familiar with it, but it can walk you through that process. It looks a bit like this. These are arguments, and when I walk the room and I ask students to share them with me, I can make an assessment of whether or not they have all of the elements of a form. These are some structures you'll find on page 10 of the Make Writing Starter Set, or 8, or page 9. They are not the structures, and I encourage you to analyze your mentor texts that you're using with students and use that analysis to define the structures of the form that you're trying to create. But these are examples of what it looks like very early on in a writing unit when I've asked writers to rapidly prototype the whole of a draft so that I can assess the viability of an idea before I begin teaching into it one small block at a time. If you're taking a peek at this particular slide deck, you'll be able to listen to my friend Mariana make an argument about something of interest in her neighborhood as a newcomer to the country. And as you listen, you might position yourself as I did that day. Listen for which parts of the form are present, which are missing, and which need to be supported better. How might you use this sort of documentation to make a formative assessment of where Mariana is so that you might move her forward in a way that makes sense? You can do the same thing by listening to my friend Emma as well. She's a kindergarten writer. And I'll ask you to pause and document and reflect again, just like I did with my friends last week in Alberta, Canada. How is today's learning changing your thinking? How is this approach, this quick drop into a newsletter, changing the way you engage in professional learning? How might all of this influence your future work, either as a teacher, an administrator, or a professional learning facilitator yourself? This bit about structure, building it, transitioning it to print one small bit at a time, is important because it's the process of transcription that supports transposition, which is an even richer concept to sink into. Transpositional grammar And everything I understand about it came from Bill Cope and Mary Kalantzis, and you can click on this slide and this link to learn more. What we're really getting at here is that when we represent something with blocks, and then we ask students to act it out, and then we ask them to speak about it, and then draw it, or then produce it with written words, each shift from one mode and set of materials to another actually inspires shift in meaning as well. And that shift in meaning, it adds complexity to the way that we are thinking about an idea and its details. It also generates new details for us to consider. Multimodality and the transposition of meanings from one form to another deepens our understanding of what it is we're trying to express. It makes it more complex as we go. So meaning is represented with alphabetic text and images and sound and vibration and objects and body movement. And when we know the structure of a form, we can use any of those modes of expression to represent each part. And multimodal expression helps us protect the complexity of those ideas and words because it gives us ways to represent them other than written words. And if we can transcribe them one small bit at a time, we can rely on all of those really important phonics skills that support transcription so well in the work of encoding. Writers have to hear what it is they want to produce, and I've linked to two small bits of research for your consideration here. Audio recording, partner echoing, whisper writing. These are all ways that writers can hear the sound as they're writing the symbols that represent it. This enables encoding. Labels can support word and sentence level work. If students have drawn the beginning of a story or built it, and I ask them to label everything in it, as the teacher, I can make informed decisions about which of those words we're going to practice, and they can align with the patterns, the words, and the strategies that we've been exploring in other dimensions of our literacy work, for instance, as readers. Making writing invites intentional encoding practices. I've linked to some resources here for those of you who are interested in thinking about if they build a story one bit at a time and they transition it bit by bit to written words. How might I integrate support for synthetic and analytic reading and writing routines there? How might I use it as an opportunity to review previously taught phonics patterns? You can even bring your sound boxes into this work. The expectation is that writers will voice the sound of each segment as they write the words that you've identified and prioritized. They hear the sound and write the letter, and then when they see the letter, they say the letter. It's really important during this particular time that they are invited to segment those words, particularly young writers who are working on multisyllabic segmenting. Coach them to make the sound of each segment as they write the targeted word. This practice doesn't disappear. Making writing also supports paragraph and passage level work as writers gain more experience and grow older. There is a decoding threshold that does exist, and it aligns to our understanding of the fact that the sort of decoding that children do at the primary level is different from what they're challenged to do as they grow older, and syntax becomes more complex, as well as spelling conventions. Oftentimes, when I ask middle school and high school writers to build the whole of an essay, it might look a little bit like this. And as they express themselves orally, I notice that that expression is somewhat paratactic. When we make writing bit by bit, we can begin to normalize decoding in grades 3 through 12, and we can also work with other linguistic structures and word functions. We can even coach morphological awareness so that writers are able to begin producing more hypotactic, more complex sentences and paragraphs. Structure matters, bit by bit matters, materials matter. Being able to hear what it is we would produce with written words really matters. If you're exploring this independently or in a small group, you might take a minute to pause and document and reflect your learning there. Maybe there's just a moment between the last 10 minutes that really mattered. Or maybe you're beginning to trace your learning across moments that have unfolded every 10 minutes or so over the last 35. I hope that as you're documenting your learning here, it might turn into something of an expedition for you that carries you through the summer and maybe into next year. When I'm leading instructional planning with K2 teachers, it looks a bit like this, and this is 312. Here's a unit in K2, and here's a unit in 312. And here is how we might begin to bridge the building of a form bit by bit to the assessment process. If I know that a fictional narrative is grounded in the structure, it's a very familiar one. Kylene Beers has referred to it before, and I'm referencing it, the originators on the last page of my slide deck. If the form is somebody wanted but so then, I can think about the very specific strategies that I want to use to coach the development of that form. Each of those orange flags represents a day of learning, and each day of learning involves building it, bettering the build, and transitioning it to written words. We stretch into each block of that form word by sentence by paragraph. Where do those mini lessons come from? It makes sense that instructionally, you start unmaking some of the beautiful things that you read. Here I've cut apart an Augusten Burroughs piece, and I'm asking myself, what is the author doing? I'm asking myself how. And that helps me come up with strategies to teach other writers. First, they build it, then they transition it to written words. As writers are making, I typically use this mastery scale, a log, and I walk the room and I document the degree to which they can perform those skills by making, drawing, or speaking, and then tick it out the door as they transition them to print. I look at the performance with alphabetical text. This leads to much better assessment congruence. If I want to know if a writer can create a character, written words often produce a screen that make it difficult for me to get an accurate assessment of their ability to perform that particular skill. Representing their ideas using materials or spoken words or performance enables me to get a cleaner sense of whether or not they're able to create a character. Being able to decipher between what they're able to do multimodally and what they're able to do with alphabetic text makes me a far better diagnostician. Documenting progress toward learning targets often can look like this. I can create a setting. I can use color or texture inside of my setting to create a mood. I can use dialogue to show how a character feels. Oftentimes it looks like this, and if you take a peek at these images captured in my friend Lisa Green's classroom in West Valley, New York, you can see the level of detail and the complex representation of ideas that comes out of this work. Imagine labels next, word work, and then a transition to written words. Imagine the quality and the volume of print that emerges. And when we differentiate our mini lessons, writers are able to craft incredibly sophisticated things. This is a second grade classroom in the fall of this year, and Lisa's students wrote multi-page drafts that were stories involving characters that changed over time. Every time I approach a learning target, I'm prepared for the fact that some students may only produce labels, some might produce phrases, some short passages, and some lengthy ideas. It tends to look like this. And I need to be able to move writers from one place to another. You might want to pause here and ask yourself, if you were to document learning progress toward a target, depending on the target, different tools are better options. Think about that as you move forward. In a future newsletter, I'm going to speak with all of you about creating multimodal products. Grading these is actually a bit easier than generating assessment data and then grades that can be reported to other stakeholders when you're creating a multimodal process. I'll invite you to come back to this particular page in our slide deck, though. If you take a peek at this page, it looks much like a gradebook would, only what you're noticing is across the top, I don't have the name of tasks. I have learning targets. And each of those targets were a piece of the story making process. There were probably many more of them as well. Here, we're going to get a more granular and specific view of the very sort of small skills and strategies students might perform to be able to make that particular story. We're going to rely on mode rather than average when we're moving toward the grade book and the report card as well. I will also be looking at that lower number. And eventually, the finished product, the written story, can weigh into this decision-making process as well. If you'd like to learn more about standards-based grading and how it's a good fit for this sort of work, I'm going to drop another document into this week's newsletter. It's a frequently asked questions document that I use when I'm working inside of systems and we are all moving towards standards-based grading in a K-5 or a K-12 context together. If you have more questions about this, I hope you'll drop me a line. And again, I'm only providing you an aerial view of this work that I do. But I'd like to begin to open more conversations about how many of you might move toward supporting multiliterate and really diverse learners inside of your own writing workshops and classrooms. Thanks for hanging in with me, and I hope that you'll reach out if you would like to talk more.